Good morning, everybody. So we've been, as we've heard this morning, technology, disruption, AI comes up a lot in every single conversation that we embark on. And given that we work on innovation, given that as we are formulating and launching the National Commission of Innovation, one of the key themes that comes up in a lot of these discussions revolves around the role of AI, the role of digitization as we think about policy making in the next coming years. It is not just about focusing on the implications that policies will have on these technologies that are emerging and that are being used a lot more within the industries, within academia, within how we think about competition. What we started thinking about was AI is here today. As we heard Janet say, even though it is at its infancy, there are numerous different applications and numerous different areas where AI is actually impacting all of our lives and impacting all of the work that we do. So the question that we started thinking about was, what if we start thinking about AI being a commissioner to play a role in helping the policy making to think about technology coming in the future? Now that's an interesting thought. An AI commissioner. Not an AI commissioner who formulates policies about AI, but an AI commissioner who works alongside people, the best and the brilliant minds that have assembled, to start allowing for aiding the work that we're doing, to bring in an advisory role, to play an advisory role in the only way that technology can play, which is to scale the kinds of thinking that we as humans always tend to have limitations on, and will continue to. So let me step back. What does that really mean, an AI commissioner? So we heard about an assistant. AI is an assistant. Well, let's sort of use that as an exemplar and say, AI will become an assistant to each one of our areas that we're working on to then determine how we can better, faster, in a bigger way, scale and scour a lot of data that exists. Data is at the center of a lot of decisions that we make. Data is at the center of policies and thinking that we are embarking on. So now, what kind of data are we talking about? Let's think about, if you think about the data that we have collected over the years, it's conversations that we're having, it's debates that people have, it's information that as you listen to key influencers, as you listen to academicians, as you listen to prior years' research work that has been conducted, as you sort of understand and assimilate that, it is impossible for humans to do that, one person to do that, or multiple people to do that at scale, at the speed at which we need it today. So that is the idea, is how do we start thinking about using AI to assist us in our role in policy making? Now, I'm not by any means a policy maker. I'm not an expert. That's not the experience that I have. I am a technologist by background. So that's how I think. So bear with me as we sort of start thinking through this. So we want to start thinking about how do we start using AI within the role of policy making. Now, what is policy making at the core of it? That's how I like to think. Policy making, it is about, creating a target, right? Trying to define what is your problem or challenge or objective that you have in mind. We're after the broad space of competition, staying ahead from a competitive perspective as a country. As we've heard Deborah and our chairman Mahmood talk about both yesterday and today. Great, so that's a great start. Now, what are some of the next things you need to do? Well, we need to start formulating the policy. And as you start formulating the policy, you're considering a number of different factors that go into what constitutes the decision making. Now, once you formulate the policy, you put these into action, you take decisions, and then you evaluate whether these are working, these are not working, and then you come back and you correct, and you do this over and over again. Now, what is happening, though, is this is something that has happened for decades, possibly, right? If not centuries, it has certainly happened for decades as we know it. So if we think about sort of meaningful debates around the interpretations for insights, I think one of the challenges that I find personally in terms of policymaking is time, is scale, right? We always tend to think that once we let trends take over, once the trends are happening, they're happening at the grassroots level, top down, bottoms up, a lot of things come together and certain trends emerge. Then we start thinking about policy, then we have debates, and by the time you formulate actions, new trends have emerged. So how do we start compressing the timelines that we're thinking about? You know, an interesting stat is 52% of the companies that were in the Fortune 500 in 2000 don't exist anymore. 52% of the companies. Now, that's not an unknown phenomenon because you know, companies back in the 1958, I think, had a lifespan of about 61 years. In the 80s, now that's about 24 years. And already we're seeing that to be reducing. So how do we sort of stay ahead in this game without using technology? Well, it's a no-brainer in my mind. And I'm really trying to think about how we can start thinking about this. Excuse me. So if you think about policymaking and other challenges in this, now conflicts is a great example of potential policy conflicts happen all the time. One of the reasons why potentially it takes time is because, excuse me, as you're trying to resolve these conflicts, right? So, for example, you know, if you're trying to say, how do you have an expansionary demand side policy, and you're doing that to reduce unemployment, but then what that could have a conflict is in potentially rising externalities, or it could be rising inflation. So there's always sort of these trade-offs that need to be made. There are always these sort of conflicts that we need to resolve. Now, if you think about, you know, Tinbergen's rule that can be applied, for example, a Dutch economist, Jan Tinbergen, you know, in my simple mind, it's a simple rule of thumb that essentially says that, you know, policymakers that are really trying to achieve multiple economic targets, which in most cases people are, you tend to have control. You need to have control over at least one policy tool per economic factor that you're trying to manage, right? Very simplistic. And why do we say that? Well, why did he say that? Well, primarily because achieving a certain economic targets precludes other targets. And so that's why it's always a little bit of a trade-off. So as an example, if you have a central bank that has power to just influence the supply side of money in the overall economy, it can either control inflation or it can control the exchange rate, right? It cannot simultaneously ensure a low inflation and a depreciating currency because if you decrease the money supply to lower the inflation, you are going to cause currency appreciation. So the point is that these are just examples that I'm citing to state the fact that policymaking involves some of these kinds of challenges that I've been talking about. Now, to me, that's actually a beautiful thing. Why? As a technologist, when I'm thinking about this, to me, it's a beautiful thing because some of these challenges that we're talking about is really at the core of that is discovering correlations between the various data points that we have, right? A lot of different data, you're finding correlations. Now, why is that a beautiful thing? Well, it is because one of the AI technologies that we hear and we talk about all the time is machine learning. And you know what? The fundamental thing that machine learning does really well today? Discovering correlations. And it does that at scale. It does that at speed. Obviously, the advances in hardware, and we've learned about we've heard about that a couple times this morning already, advances in hardware, advances in more fundamental research techniques, applied innovation, is rapidly improving the cycle times of how fast we can scale this. So why wouldn't machine learning be applicable to policy making? And again, I'm going to use that as a simple example. Machine learning is just one of the AI techniques, right? But I'm going to zoom in that for just a second here. So what does machine learning really do? Well, what it does is it is discovering weights for connections in the network so that essentially every input can activate a particularly correct output that is associated to that, right? And in this way, you find, machine learning finds a lot of different sort of correlations between inputs and outputs. And honestly, that is essentially all machine learning all that machine learning does. Now, that is going back to the problem that we have, which is fascinating. Now, there are some limitations to machine learning techniques. For example, causality, right? We should make sure that we don't mistake correlation to causality. So that's where the human augmentation and the experience that we're bringing in as people comes together to work with these machine learning techniques to then quickly start having the right kinds of debates on the right kinds of data sets, on the right kinds of insights, so we're not spending all of that time trying to just discover some of these basic insights. So that's where these things start coming together. And today, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these applications in machine learning are very successful. I'm sure you each have your own examples, either within your academia, your industry, your personal life, your consumer life, in your interactions that you know of and you're familiar with. Now, what machine learning does really well is it can detect these insights even when the signal is weak, even when the data is noisy, right? And I think that's where, as humans, what we tend to do, we tend to help machine learning by throwing the right kinds of what we think are relevant data into the mix to start getting the right kinds of insights. So now you start seeing why you can start getting insights into possibly even remotely connected data sets, and you're trying to achieve these objectives for the task that we're setting out for, but at speed, at scale, at a much faster pace than we all collectively even would be able to do ever. Right? So that's why I think these things start coming together really well, and because you can now start using machine learning almost as a telescope to begin with, to find these sort of very distant signals, the weak signals, to peer into. If you view the horizon being data, you start making out these images and these correlations and these sort of diagrams that start bringing things to life. And now we can apply the intelligence and the experience that we have to action those into decision making. So this is how, as I was describing, I think if you start thinking about the fundamental challenges, or one of the I'm sure there are other challenges, but one of the fundamental challenges from my point of view in terms of policy making, machine learning starts becoming a really good fit to that. So I will sort of end this by showing you a couple of very simple examples of what we did here. So we took data that Deborah and Chad and team, the council has curated and created, called decoder data. It's a lot of data across 130 countries, across 8 dimensions of, 8 dimensions. Think about dimensions being general performance, economic complexity, capital, talent, quality of life. I mean, the things that you would think are the typical relevant data. And for 30 years. What you see here, very hard to read, but I will tell you in just one sentence as to what you're seeing here, is what is called a TSNE plot, right? And it's taking all of those dimensions into a 2-dimensional view. And really what you're seeing, that what we did was we simplified this a little bit, but this was, by the way, just done in 20 minutes, right? Just for anybody that is thinking, 20 minutes, not this, but this and a few other things. So what you're seeing here is that on the top right cluster, as we would have hypothesized, belong the data points for the United States, China, Japan. What this is telling me is that these are all similar in terms of these indicators that we are evaluating. What you see in the center concentrated there are countries in Europe, France, Germany, Italy, and there are a few others there. But what that is telling us is that while these are similar to one another, they're not the same from the dimensions that we're evaluating to these first set of countries that I talked about. And the other end of the spectrum is Russia. Now, we did hear Russia yesterday, we heard Russia today, but the point is, this is showing us what the data is, the story that the data is telling us, right? Now, we can start correlating these. Let me show you another couple of quick examples. So if you think about now, as I double-click, the second thing that I want to know, this is macro indicators are great, but I also want to understand the why. What are the features that are really impacting these outcomes that we're thinking about so that I can actually meaningfully take action on that? So this is actually showing us that, we took this for 2014 for the United States, but essentially it is showing you both the negative and the positive features that are impacting. What that starts telling you is now you can use these kinds of data points to start influencing the kinds of decisions that you need to make. And then another very quick point here is on looking at the future. So we always think about data as being historic, being in the past. what about the future? How do we start predicting things out? How do we start testing our hypotheses in a compressed timeline so that we can start making these decisions even more rapidly? So this is showing you how actually we were not too far off in terms of the yellow line shows the actuals and the white line shows the predicted. But the point is that you can start now testing these hypotheses as you look into the future. So, so again, I think the thing that we're trying, just to wrap up, the thing that we're really trying to do here is to launch this concept around an AI commissioner through this study that we are, through this National Commission of Innovation that we're kicking off, and want to start formulating some of these hypotheses to start applying AI and technology to help us in our objectives and our goals here. So with that, I really want to thank you all, and good luck for the rest of the sessions. Thank you for having me.